Good afternoon, everybody. Could we get our respective beverages to our seats, please, so that we can begin? As Dr. Ahluwalia said, that this has been indeed a fascinating discussion on the need for combining distribution with growth. And we have an excellent panel here, and I've asked Lucas to also sit on the panel so that during the question-answer sessions, if any of you have a question on his presentation, you can address that to him. But our panel, I'm not going to introduce the panel to you. You have a folder in which you have their respective CVs, but we have an excellent panel. We have Dr. Pronab Sen, who needs no introduction. He's at the International Growth Center right now. We have Himanshu, who's associate professor at JNU. He writes a lot on inequality issues. You might have read in the newspapers. And we have Sandeep Chachra, who's a social anthropologist by training and a development financial with over 2.5 decades experience in human development. So we have, as I said, an excellent panel who will sort of pick up various aspects. I'll just make a couple of points to start it off, and then we can have floor interaction. Lucas's presentation reminded me of a piece that I think the IMF had done in finance and development, and it was appropriately called "Now You See Me, Now You Don't." I don't know how many of you remember that, which was essentially talking about how you look at inequality, whether you look at it the within-country inequality or global inequality or across-country inequality. These were the three measures, out of which, two showed an increase even then, and this was, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, and one showed a decrease. And today, across country or between country inequality, again, as Lucas pointed out, has come down or shows some convergence because of the huge impacts, disproportionate impact that India and China are having on inequality. But I think more meaningful for countries like India is the within-country inequality, which is unambiguously showing an increase. And some would say that it's almost vulgar, if I were to use that word. Apologies for if I hurt any sensibilities. Almost to look at the distribution at the top 1% of the income stream. So therefore, it's no gainsaying the fact that we need to address it and what the causes and symptoms are, and policy intervention, and how it is to be done, and how long it will take to be able to address this inequality. Because as Dr. Ahluwalia also said, and when we were students, we were kind of made to believe that distribution will necessarily be a collateral damage of the growth process, and that it will, in the initial stages go down and then eventually begin to equalize as growth becomes more democratic and people acquire more skills. But I think to wait, in some sense, it's a market failure that growth is not being more equitable, that you're not being able to get equity in growth. And therefore, if it's a market failure, then you need to have direct intervention to address that market failure so that we get a more equitable distribution of income. For India specifically, I mean, the fact that there, as Lucas also said, the investments compared to China, investments in education, the investments in health, the investments in physical infrastructure has been much lower compared to China, and therefore India's growth trajectory has been relatively much more unequal than China. And one of the things that emerges within, and this is a question that I will put to the panelists, and then they can pick up on whatever thread they wish to. In India, and Lucas interestingly pointed out that there's been a withdrawal of public capital. In some sense, there's been a crowding out of public capital and a kind of ascendancy of private capital. And if you recall, India's growth process of the golden period that Lucas spoke about was really driven by private capital and not really by public capital. That was driven by private capital. So here's sort of conundrum. If the state is unable to provide for infrastructure, physical and social, to a large extent, we Indians, a lot of middle class and upper middle class Indians, have sort of circumvented the provision of public goods by doing what we call self-provision. And much of our work in the area of urbanization kind of shows that there's a lot of self-provisioning happening. So people are, don't expect the state to provide the good transport, electricity, energy, water, etc. So there's a lot of self-provisioning that is happening. If a lot of self-provision happens, and the state has inadequate resources as a result of that state self-provisioning, also because of the tax sort of aspect that Lucas pointed out, then the state is becoming even more sort of impoverished and crippled in its ability to provide those public goods. And it kind of reinforces that entire cycle that the rich and the middle class will be able to not demand better services because they can provide it on their own, and the state gets impoverished, and that cycle repeats itself. So in a sense, what Lucas was saying, the withdrawal of public capital and private capital emerges. And then you add to that, which is your low tax compliance in India, which is also impoverishing. So our tax to GDP ratios are much lower than our comparable countries, and therefore we need to somehow improve these ratios to improve the ability of the state to provide public goods and therefore have a much more democratic growth process. And of course, we don't need to kind of say here that we've had a weak redistribution mechanism or redistributive state in India. So, how do you, and of course, Dr. Ahluwalia spoke about the jobs challenge and the informality challenge, and that which probably has added to the growing level of inequality in India. So tax compliance, job creation, lack of provision of public goods, and of course not to mention the data. We need to also improve the quality of the data that is available in order to make better policy interventions within India. So I kind of stop here. I've thrown up some issues, and I'd leave it to the panelists to pick up on any of the threads that either Lucas mentioned or I have flagged. I will start with Dr. Sen on the extreme right, and I'll move to the left appropriately. And then we'll throw it open for discussions. So thank you all very much for being here. Dr. Sen.
Thank you. I hope you called me right simply because of my physical location and not my my political ideologies. Okay.
Absolutely.
Because some of that may actually come out. I think of the issues that were raised by Lucas and you, Himanshu and Sandeep are more competent to talk about some of them. I'll restrict myself to a few issues which at one time used to be very high on the public discourse agenda and which have dropped off the map and indeed going in the opposite direction. And this phenomenon is not in any sense sort of a natural, unorchestrated event. I think it's very orchestrated, and I think much of that is something that Lucas may want to address as we go forward. The first one is something that the economics profession simply hasn't taken up in the manner that it should have. In fact, I find very little, if anything at all, on this issue. I don't know how many in the audience are trained in economics, but the ones who are would know that almost all of our understanding of economics ultimately is based on the notion that capitalists essentially are profit maximizers. And the whole notion of how an economy works, how a market economy works, the general equilibrium system, depends critically on this assumption of profit maximization. And all the predictions of general equilibrium models work on that basis. If you've actually been looking at what's happened to the world, there are larger and larger chunks of the private economy where profit maximization is no longer the prime driver of business decision making. It's moved from maximizing profits to maximizing valuations. So what you're looking at is not the flow value of your earnings, but the value of the stock that you're holding of an asset. This in itself is an interesting shift, because think of where valuation, how valuations go up. If I hold a share, the share value is going to go up if there is some idiot out there who is willing to pay more for my share than its current valuation. And the more idiots there are, the better it becomes. Now think of who the idiots are. It's precisely the group of people who don't have very much. So, this whole thing, nowadays you hear about it, ki mutual fund sahi hai. Who are you addressing? You're addressing the guy who would have put it in a fixed deposit. Right? You're saying, no, that's a terrible thing to do. Put it into the stock market so that the valuation of his stock goes up, and then he can sell out and you lose your shirt. So when we are talking about wealth, it's the distribution, the redistribution of wealth that's happening directly, not just a change that's happening in the accumulation process. Economics has not taken this into account. We have not reworked the fundamentals of general equilibrium theory, and it's possibly the single biggest weakness of the economic profession today. But that's only one part of the story. Let's take the other one. I think a lot of us grew up with this notion. It's a very Wickselian notion. It comes back from way back 100 years ago, of a natural rate of interest. As late as the 1980s, the estimates of the natural interest rate, real interest rate in the United States was 5%. Typically, it was believed that poor countries would have higher levels of natural interest rate. We are now being told by the Reserve Bank of India that the natural interest rate in India is 1.5%. Not significantly different from what it is in the United States of America. What does it mean? What it means, in effect, is that in public discourse, you're saying that the saver doesn't deserve to get too much of a return on his savings, and that the benefit of that saving should actually get transferred to the borrower. The third element is that there has been a concerted drive across the world to hammer into the heads of governments that fiscal deficits are bad things. They're terrible things to have. And we as a country, of course, have bought into it 100%, despite the fact that there's enough, I think, compelling both evidence and theory, which suggests that if the public debt is held by your own citizens, there is no way that the government can go bankrupt. It's only when it's held by foreigners that you run into a problem. But there is now this total paranoia about the combined fiscal deficit of the government staying above 6%. It's a terrible thing to happen. Linked to the fiscal deficit issue, and I'm not making it as a separate point, but it's very closely linked, comes from the same source, is paranoia about public debt as a whole, this total stock of public debt, which you talked about. It's a part of his, public capital. It's the negative part of it. Public debt is seen as a bad thing. And again, popular opinion says that for developed countries, public debt of 60% of GDP is okay. For poor countries, it should be 40%. India runs a 68% public debt. That's our level at the moment. And this is a terrible thing to happen. Despite the fact there is now enough, again, empirical evidence, which suggests that, which says, number one, we haven't been able to find a level of public debt at which things become worse. But more importantly, there are studies which say that in the case of private debt, if private debt goes above 90% of GDP, then the likelihood is that it will have a negative effect on the growth of the economy. But have you ever heard anybody discussing the level of private debt in a country? No, I mean, that you don't need to worry about that, right? If some guy fails, he goes out of business. But the fact of the matter remains that we are ultimately talking about stocks. So if one guy goes under, it basically means it's getting transferred somewhere else. Public debt, on the other hand, is a whipping boy of everybody. And the fourth point, there used to be a time, and mind you, I'm a macroeconomist, I can see several macroeconomists sitting around here. When we were sort of growing up in our macroeconomics, one of the things that engaged our attention very substantially was what is called the yield curve, which is the distribution of the interest rate from very short-term loans, say 3-month loans, to very long-term loans like 15-year loans. When was the last time anybody here heard anybody, including the Reserve Bank of India, talk about the yield curve? I can't. And I follow this fairly closely. Why is it important? The reason is that the shorter end, that is short maturity debt, is almost always for supporting current production. It's working capital. It's what supports the hiring of workers, the purchase of inputs, and so on. That's what the short end of debt does. The long end of debt is what creates assets. Today we have a situation. Well, historically, let's go back. Historically, it was believed that the difference between a 15-year debt and, let's say, a 1-year debt should be at least 3 percentage points. Do you know how much it is in India today? 0.3. Right? So what you're saying, in effect, that it will cost you exactly the same to do current production as to actually buy yourself an asset. That's the incentive structure you're giving. What you're saying, in effect, is, why are you bothered with hard work and producing stuff? Put your money in assets. That's the long and short of the story. These are three things that one can see happening. All of these have essentially come from the fact that the discourse, the whole macroeconomic discourse, has actually shifted out of the hands of academia and has moved into the hands of essentially finance capital. It's the investment bankers. Today you ask people about who are the macroeconomists who come to their mind, invariably you'll find it's somebody working for an investment bank. You won't find somebody thinking of somebody in JNU, okay, or Delhi School of Economics, but they'll tell you, Credit Suisse or HSBC or whoever you have, bang, it comes. And this, I'm almost certain, is not happenstance. This is orchestrated, and in a sense, we have given silent acquiescence to what is going on. Thank you. I'll come back later if there are questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sen, for raising some fundamental issues, including on the fiscal deficit, where we have a finance commission now that maybe we'll be able to talk about that during the questions. May I request Himanshu now for his introductory remarks? Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat, for having this launch here. It's important to remind us time and again about the issue of inequality. But I'm a little worried about the report being released here in India, in Delhi. The last time Piketty wrote a paper on inequality, the government banned the tax data for 12 years.
This is true.
So be careful when you release a report on inequality in India and not be surprised about it. This has happened with the poverty estimates also. The first time a government is going to go into elections in 2019 without having any idea of any estimate on employment or on poverty. So the RBI is taking a 1 year to count the notes is not just an exception. That has become a rule now. So I'm a little worried about talking too much about inequality and its impact on our statistical system. So that is something which will not get into it. But I must say that this is something which is a very important addition to the work that has been done by the Top Income Database and the World Inequality Database, and I have been in touch with the entire team in that sense quite a period of time. And this was a big gap. The India story obviously has been a big gap in the entire story. And I must congratulate the team for having worked so hard to bring together a time series data where the data doesn't exist, to bring in through regressions and other techniques to fill in the data gaps. But I'm not surprised by the outcome, in the sense that this is something, now there are, at least hundreds of databases, hundreds of sources, which will give you the same story, whether you use this assumption or that assumption. The fact that inequality has been rising, and rising secularly, without any sign of a decline in inequality, is now a 40-year-old story, and that's your data that clearly shows. And this is something that has been in public discussion for at least 3 decades. Definitely in stronger terms and in something which has been talked about. And even without the report, I'm sure anybody in this room wouldn't need to get this figure on the PowerPoint to believe that inequality has increased in this country. And that is the crux of the story, that we have inequality rising for the last 40 years, something which has been time and again hammered. And this government, when it comes, the first thing that it does is abolishes wealth tax. We don't have an inheritance tax, and we know the kind of tax exemptions that we are talking about. But even then, building on that, producing the time series data is an important contribution to reminding us where we have reached in the last 30, 40 years. But if I have to look at the report, come back strictly to the report, there are 3 important points that you mentioned, and I'm just going to reiterate these in different words. One is that not all growth will have same outcomes as far as income distribution is concerned. The golden age of capitalism has seen a decline in inequality, and so is the case in India, where 80s were not seeing an increase in inequalities to the 90s onwards, where the inequality has increased. So every acceleration of growth rate does not have to come with a rising inequality. And that assumption of the Kuznets that every time you grow, you have to come out with that. And China is a very good example of this. So is the case with other countries that you can think of. There are now a number of countries where you can. So this whole dictum that we have been, time and again, has been kind of put in our minds, that inequality is an inevitable consequence of growth. And every time you talk about inequality, the gun is put on your head. Do you want growth to go down? That is something which is a big fallacy, and something that we must get rid of as soon as possible. Secondly, I think, before I come to the inequality, India's story, the second part is again very important, that over the world, if you're looking at the whole world story, you are looking at that it is as much about growth, but it is also about your political priorities. And this has nothing to do with democracy and not having democracy. If you're looking at India and China, or if you're looking at different kinds of democracy, you have Europe and US in different ways. And I think the issues that basically are important are what are the priorities of the government, what are the basic fundamentals that the government should be looking at if it wants to tackle inequality. And certainly fiscal policy is only a very, very small part of the entire landscape of reducing inequality, and you know it very well, more than anybody here, that the reduction in Brazilian inequality through the wage indexation and implementation of minimum wage laws or labor laws has had a larger impact than, say, any other place that you can think of. And fiscal policy also has contributed to in different ways. But I don't think we are going to have any lessons being learned, at least in this case. But I must come to really the story on India, and that is just something which is an important part of it, and that is where the public wealth and private wealth are important. And at least in the last three decades, when we have had almost like a belief that growth is the end of the road and everything else will fall into place, despite the fact that we have talked about inclusive growth, and we are very good in talking about inclusive growth, but also talking about everything possible to have an exclusive growth, including in terms of tax policy or in terms of, say, other measures of it. And now this is coming out on the street. This is something which is no longer hidden in documents where you can question on the data. And that's why I'm not getting into the whole data issue. Because whatever you do, those conclusions are in this case inescapable. But in India, there are two more issues which are important. One is, because India is a large country that we are talking about. We are not talking about one homogeneous country with a single language and we are talking about a huge spectrum of, and this is where the question that has been put, or what Stewart, for example, talks about the horizontal inequality kind of issues, that where you are born, who you are born to, and where you are brought up, are issues that continue to hold important. Issues of caste, issues of gender, issues of regional deprivation, issues of those things are now becoming more and more important. And those issues have not disappeared, despite we claiming so much about it. So if you break it down, those inequalities, and break it down into different forms of it, then I would suspect that the level of inequality or the starkness of the inequality is something that becomes really, really clear to anybody who has been looking at the Indian economy. But yes, if one would like to have some kind of a suggestion for this particular exercise, and something that one should be trying doing it, is that, and this is something which I've been saying it earlier, or I've said it earlier also, this focus on top incomes in that sense, the whole top 1% and all that, it's something which has brought in the whole issue, because it's so stark. The moment you say that 1% hold 58%, 1% does it, something like that. And it is the shock therapy that this kind of a report does. But it at the same time, it somewhere fails to, and this is something which is a new addition, which is what you have done, which is quite good, is what is happening to the bottom 10%, bottom 20%, bottom 30%, and bottom 40%. Something which would come normally in the poverty debate. And I'm really happy you're doing it, because I'm not sure that we are going to have any poverty estimates anymore in this country. So probably this will continue to be where we can focus back on the bottom 10% and 20%. And the last line that I have to say, there in the last 10, 15 years, the story is also very interesting. That the top 1% has grown, top 5% has grown, top 10% has grown. But it's not that the bottom 30 or 40% have actually lost out. It's actually the middle which has been squeezed. If you look at the distribution from different angles, and that is something which is your tax data will not be able to capture in a different, because our survey data is fairly complicated. It's not something which is straightforward that you can use it in your exercises, nor is the IHDS income data. All of them have complications. But if you try and do a granular analysis of it, then you realize that it is the bottom 30% which has done really well, and something that doesn't get captured so easily. It is the top 10% which has, again, done really well. But it is the bottom which has been squeezed out. And that the squeezing out of the bottom is not obvious only in income terms, but it is the level of vulnerability, or the vulnerability. Or if you kind of try and have an odds ratio, or the kind of probability of you falling back into poverty, that is something which has increased. So that vulnerabilities have increased. And to a certain extent, the privatization story that you have brought in it appears to be, if you talk about the same privatization story in a different language, which is what people like Sandeep and others have been talking about, privatization of public services, health services or education services, or for example, where now the mantra is insurance for everything. You don't complain about bad roads and pothole roads. The question is, have you got your insurance or not? So once you have got your, that's what the government is telling to the farmers. Don't expect anything from me. Bothered about it? Go and get an insurance. It's a different matter that insurance doesn't work on any individual plot. But that's the story that we are talking about. But I think this privatization of wealth or the privatization or the loss of public services is a very, very important story. How we have lost out on these issues need to be brought out, not just in terms of public wealth versus private wealth, but the impact it has or the ability of the government to do something about in the next 30 years. You can't reduce inequality by basically destroying the generation for the last 30 years. The IT revolution was built on the IITs which were created in the 1950s. You wouldn't have had that kind of a public education thing, then you wouldn't have been able to do it. And similarly, the 30 years that you're losing out on public health and public education, where our inequality numbers continue to be, or even our malnutrition numbers continue to be so stark, that basically means that any effort to reduce inequality will not just be a fiscal effort, but will be an effort which will require multidimensional attack, multidimensional effort at the bottom end of the distribution, and we will need more granular kind of an analysis at the bottom end, not just on income and wealth dimension, but on multiple dimensions. And I think that's a beginning of the story, and we will be doing more of these kind of stories in the coming years to come. What impact it will have, that's something I'm not sure about. Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshu. I think the reiteration of what Dr. Sen also said, that the macroeconomic sort of representative agent model has to give way to look at the distributional consequences as well, and inequality need not be a necessary consequence of the growth. So I think some of this looking at heterogeneous individuals as opposed to the representative agent model of macroeconomics, that literature is beginning to emerge, and hopefully will have much more of focus, policy focus, on the distribution rather than on just growth. Our final speaker, Sandeep Chachra. So may I request Sandeep to make his remarks, please? Thank you.
Thank you. It's an absolute honor to be here, Rajat, and to be with you, Lucas. You know what? Your work in these years has actually introduced Marx to many on the younger generation. In fact, my daughter started reading Marx after your book on Capital in the 21st century. So it's really, really very interesting, Piketty and yours. Yeah? I will not speak too much, and I just will get into one issue today. This morning it was mentioned, the role of informal workers. In fact, Dr. Isha was mentioning it. And you talked about this European way of sharing growth as one of the recommendations or one of the possibilities going forward. In fact, Graf seems to suggest that. And I was just in my mind as I was sitting there trying to imply this and apply this, including the 6 conclusions of this report, or ways forward outlined in this report, Lucas, to how would it work in the context of India? Imagining that today there is a full-blown agrarian crisis, imagining that today the rural India faces, and we work as Action Aid in that bits, faces a huge degree of distress, which has been analyzed by people like Himanshu here and by Pronab and Rajat yourselves. How do we sort of apply this situation? What would it mean? The report, for example, talks of increasing investments in public education, obviously, public health, obviously, talks, for instance, about progressive taxation, talks, for instance, about an international financial register. It does also talk of, very interestingly, it does also talk of the question of decent wages, not just minimum, but decent wages and better labor conditions. Imagine we were to apply this in the context of India. And imagine we were to now, and we were to then look at the context of where we are with roughly about 500 million people in the informal economy, informals of India, so to say. And to this, in the next 2 decades, would probably be added, going by government's own estimations, another 200 million who would be out of farming, That's the estimation. So we have about 600 million people, somewhat as peasant farmers today, largely as peasant farmers today, and were these to get out over the next 2 decades, we're looking at a figure of around 500-600 million people in the context of India alone. And this is not a unique story of India. I mean, I could very well take us to China, or I could very well take us to South Africa, and probably the numbers will vary, but the directions are the same. And imagine then we were to create full employment on what the report suggests as the way of decent wages for 600 million people, let's say, in our own context. We, of course, have the ideas of Skill India. We obviously, I think, what kind of absorption, where would it happen in the economy? This is a question to be discussed. I mean, I can't imagine 600 million people in the next 2 decades, Ishar was saying this morning, be absorbed in the formal economy. We know the state of how labor absorption is happening in the kind of industry in this century at least. And this model itself is somewhat more, I would think it's a fallacious model, because this model of the entire thinking is based on an idea of a classical economic transition, an agrarian transition, where we are thinking of bringing people out of agriculture from a peasant past into a non-agricultural future. It has been happening over precisely the same period that you talked of, the last 4 decades, Himanshu, more increasingly so in the last 2. And imagine we were to take them out of agriculture. Now, this doesn't look real to me. I mean, which sector of the economy would absorb 600 million people? Forget minimum wages, we're talking of decent wages. It's not going to. The situation doesn't look so. So we're looking at this question, and analyzing this question, let's go back a bit. Now, obviously, this rests itself on an assumption of what happened in Europe in the 19th century, what is called the classical transition, where millions of people were taken out of agriculture. England, for example, had 60% or 65% people dependent on agriculture in that century, and today it has 4%. The same thing could be said about Germany. But how did it happen during that time? There are assumptions, and can those assumptions be repeated now? In that century, it happened because there was obviously the colonial accumulation, there was obviously the export of populations, and there was obviously labor-intensive industrialization with that accumulated resource. That's unlikely to happen. So we in a sense, this model might not run, the suggestions might not run if we were to apply, obviously, public investments in health, public investments in education. Obviously, all these things will help, but then they're not going to fundamentally address the challenges which India faces in terms of massive inequalities, of which land is central. So the argument I am making is, unless we look at the question of land, unless we look at the question of investments in peasant agriculture, no progress on any potential sort of better future on reducing inequalities is possible in a substantive manner in an agrarian economy that India is today, because all assumptions of transition from an agrarian past to a non-agrarian future seem pretty fallacious under the circumstances that we are in today. I'll say this much for now, and I look forward to a more engaged debate on other issues. One can equally well talk about the role of welfare state, on how we look at welfare state, what lessons have been on the welfare state. And just to close, I will also say maybe it would have been very interesting if we had looked at the question of inequality from the perspective of women. And maybe your forthcoming ideas could just look at the world from the perspective of women, of how would it look like were this report being done for women, by women, and with the view of women in mind. Thank you so much.
Just to make a plug for ICRIER, if you wait until March 2018, Sandeep, we'll have something, at least initial, an initial paper on that aspect, on gender-based inequality. Okay, I hate to, we're already very late, but it'll be a shame if we don't get to interact with Lucas and our panelists, because I think it's been a fascinating discussion. So I'll straight away go to questions. We'll take 5 at a time. And may I request you to please be brief so that we can have a sort of equitable distribution of the questions, if not the growth. Yes, we'll start from here and then Bala. Please introduce yourselves and very brief.
Well, my name is BKP Sinha. I am from forestry profession. And I am at present the founder, vice president of the School of Natural Resources and Sustainable Development at Amity in University. So the question of land is very, very important because, what is happening in the growth, the productivity of the land is going down. We have polluted all the river systems. We have deforested all the forest, and we have lost all the biodiversity, and this is not in your national accounts. The economist has failed to factor it in the national accounts, and Parliament is not being informed that if you take depreciation of natural resources into the national account, then the real growth is negative. So when you are computing the growth, economic growth, you must take into account the depreciation of natural resources and what is happening with the tribals, most marginalized group, the primitive tribal groups in the Odisha. Their income, their standard of living, their quality of life is going down. And you are telling that you are constructing roads in Bastar. And what is happening, I know there is a social unrest. So why can't we have a steady state growth of Harman Daly? And because this neoclassical economics doesn't take into account the long-term sustainability. The question was asked to Keynes, the father of the neoclassical economist, that what about the long term? And he said, then long term we are all dead. So he has no answer to this. So when you talk of the sustainable development, this has become very, very important.
Thank you, sir. Can you please pass the mic behind you? Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat. I'll be very brief. I'm Pulapra Balakrishnan. I teach economics. This is a question to the author of the report, Luca. A very, very impressive report. I have two questions which don't require more than one sentence answers. One of your first figures, which had the bar chart, had this data that India had one of the highest inequalities. If you look at the top 10%, would it make any difference to use a measure that summarizes the distribution? Would it make any difference if you would use the Gini? And the other is public capital. I'm very impressed, or rather struck, that even for advanced economies like the United States, you believe that roads and hospitals and one more thing, I forget, infrastructure, roads and schools made such a difference. I mean, the importance of that for India is so much more. But without going into the details, sentence, if you could tell me, how do you value public assets? Yeah. So.
Thank you. There's a question back there, lady. Krishan?
Thank you. I'm Mala Kapoor Shankadas, professor at Delhi University. I work on development, health, and aging issues. I was just wondering if you would like to comment on the impact of population aging on inequality and poverty debates, which is going around, and especially affecting Europe. And of course, China and India too.
From alternative futures, we look to the year 2050. One colleague here said about the land, but without water you cannot touch even the land. You need land and water both to increase production, wealth and everything. So do consider both of them together before you do anything else. Thank you. One more.
And then we'll do a second round. Radhika, yeah.
So, Luca, if I read your graph correctly, when you show the share of the top 10% in India, it's been rising quite steadily from about the 1990s till 2010. And after 2010, there was some kind of stagnation. I mean, I was just wondering if any of the other panelists could explain why are we seeing this stagnation in the share of the top 10% after 2010?
Okay, thank you for the questions. We'll do a second round, please. Please be patient. Let me invite Luca first, and then I'll invite the panelists.
Thank you very much for the very insightful and interesting comments and questions. So there's a lot of points. Let me try to address most of them. First, on this very interesting question on the Gini, other measures of inequality. basically we try. I mean, all these different indicators can be available on the website. If we were looking at the Indian Gini, India would still be, in the recent period at the top of among the most unequal countries. The problem with the Gini Index basically is that it often is used to hide a lot of problematic data under the carpet. So basically, when you use Gini Index, which is a very good synthetic measure of inequality, very often it's used with household survey data. So basically, you have very, very implausibly low top income shares, and you don't see this in the Gini because it is this synthetic measure of inequality. So we very much prefer to use not only one index, not only one indicator, but several ones. So the top 1, top 10, middle 40, bottom 50, it's a bit more, it's less synthetic, a bit longer, but we feel that it is much more precise, much more accurate to a sounder basis for the study of inequality. How do we value public assets? We look at national accounts, and we can perhaps go into the more technical details after all this is well described in the report. The second substantial point on the environment, very much agree with the points that were made. The challenge in front of India today and in front of all countries in the world is not only how to share growth, it's how to share growth without destroying the environment. And this is not only indeed an industrialized country issue, it's also very much an issue for India itself, because more pollution harms everybody, but the poor will be harmed first. Always, we have a lot of studies showing this. So one point here on that, whereas national accounts need to make a lot of progresses, and this has been started, the World Bank is doing very interesting work on that, and we're also pursuing this work in partnership with some people at the World Bank on evaluating environmental assets in our estimates of national income. The first thing is to stop using GDP. Using GDP is a production measure. So what we use instead, I mean, we have all the GDP estimates, but what we've been using here is national income. It's already, it's a step forward from GDP to a more sustainable measure of well-being, because we subtract from it the depreciation of capital. So not all of it, not all the depreciation of natural capital, but we already subtract from this, very blind production measure, GDP, we subtract depreciation of capital to have national income, and we also add a foreign income, minus or positive, depending on the country. So we're already, we are in this beyond GDP agenda, and we're really much looking forward to that. But again, the key question, how to solve the environmental sustainability crisis with the inequality crisis is really one of the, most important challenges ahead. That being said, there are many countries that are able to address these two issues at the same time. Take Indonesia, for instance. Indonesia had a major problem when it wanted to reduce the massive fossil fuel subsidies provided by the Indonesian government to the population, because this had an important impact on the budget of low-income households. So in order not to put everyone in the streets, what Indonesia did was it reduced its fossil fuel subsidies, but used the money saved in order to create a social security, health security system. So there are ways to actually combine this environmental protection objective with this social agenda. Now, population aging, so we discussed this in the report in the case of rich countries, and you see that indeed the top wealth owners are older and older as we move to the present tense, and this links to the question of debt, which was very well discussed by Pronab Sen. In fact, okay, so the question of debt should be treated, analyzed differently in emerging countries and in rich countries. Just a rich country perspective on that. There's a very much an issue on public debt in rich countries. Why? Not because it's too high as such. Indeed, if you have high expectations of growth, you can repay your debt, and debt is also an investment in the future. But today, in rich countries, it prevents investments in the future. So the question today is whether we do austerity to reduce debt, to regain government maneuver in order to invest in the future, or whether we do alternative strategies. And this is a very important part of the European debate today, with some people defending the austerity way, and others saying, and this is the view that we defend in the report, that in fact, when we are at this very historical exception in history, where the net value of public capital is zero or lower than zero, well, governments actually, the ways they dealt with this issue, with this situation, and in a way that was working, was not cures of austerity, which further reinforce inequality, but more very progressive capital taxation, inflation. The problem with inflation is that the distributional impacts are hard to assess, or debt cancellation. In the European context, this is what happened in the 50s, 60s, in France and Germany. And by the way, the countries who mostly benefited from debt cancellation are today those who are mostly against debt cancellation. So this is a kind of a historical paradox. But this is how countries were able to regain room for maneuver, room for investing in the future by reducing debt without doing prolonged cures of austerity. Because indeed what matters in debt is the distributional impacts of debt. Who holds the debt? And in Europe, it's rich and old individuals. And the younger generation, including myself, we have to repay this debt to old individuals, debt that we did not create ourselves. So indeed, there's an issue here, and it needs to be assessed differently in different contexts. And perhaps I'll stop here to have another round of questions, or to let you answer.
Sure. So I'll let you think about the question while I go to the other panelists on what happens to women when you are in your distribution and growth. But Sandeep, do you want to respond to any question? I'll go in the reverse order this time.
Just to be quick, the question was very clear and suggestions are very clear. Sure, water, it's not just water, sir, Mr. Katpalia, it's also the forests and the commons. So obviously, the last 2.5 decades, country over, in fact, Indonesia is also a case to point, which Lucas was pointing to. There has been a huge stealth of commons, whether it's common water, whether it's common forests, whether it's common public commons of land. So the report has talked about how the public, the idea of public itself, also the notion of state itself has almost become privatized. So from a welfare idea of a state, from a social justice idea of a state, to a state which is almost an attendant state, to rampant privatization. So that also needs to be interrogated if we were to imagine any form of equality in the world or any form of justice in the world in the 21st century. So in the 20th century, the thinking that liberty and equality, that means democracy and social progress go together, probably we're closer to that thinking than we are in the second decade of the 21st century. They look completely divorced. So in a sense, I would like to sort of bring up the point that you mentioned. On the question of land, yes, absolutely. On the question of land, there is a history of exploitation. So we know that Dalits never had land or very little land. We know that hardly any woman had land. We know that Muslims and land are probably two different phenomena in a sense. So if you look at that, if you look at this last 20, 30 years, that there has been a severe reduction there. So historical question of exclusions in agriculture and land ownership, but then we have the new generation questions of those who managed to hang on despite all the pressures are being dispossessed to the land. That's happening in the last decade or so. So in a sense, that creates a pool of what is called the peasant worker. And the idea of worker is no longer very separate from the idea of peasant. The pool of people who some economists in India have called the wage hunters and gatherers, who are in a sense hangers-on in history. So they have not the past, they have not the future. So how do you sort of look at these issues? One has to address the fundamental unfinished agenda of land reforms. It's very central to the Indian context.